That morning in Millfield began with a chill that didn't come from the weather, but from the feeling of having entered a house where something essential was missing and no one knew how to replace it. The church smelled of waxed wood and freshly cut flowers. The murmur of the neighbors mingled with the creaking of the pews as someone shifted position to swallow back tears. Elena Harper, almost 70 years old even though people insisted she looked younger, held her handkerchief with a hand made. Slow and clumsy by arthritis. It wasn't the clumsiness that hurt her, but the awareness of being there without Robert, the man with whom she had measured the passage of time through harvests, hard-paid bills, and back-weary nights after pruning. The minister spoke of legacy, of the land, and of a job well done, and there were heads that nodded because they knew the apple orchard, as well as they knew their own kitchens. The eyes Elena sought, Michael's and Julia's, were dry, intent on something else, as if they had an appointment after the funeral service and were silently counting the minutes. When the ceremony ended, the table in the parish hall was filled with trays of apple pie, coffee, and comfortable words. It was also there that Michael took out a folder with an updated will, and Julia, without a tremble in her voice, explained that it was what Robert had wanted to protect the continuity of the business. There were no scenes, no shouts, no banging on the table, just a clean sense of displacement, as if Elena had been discreetly moved to one side so she wouldn't get in the way. The paper didn't say her name as daily life always had. It said percentages. It said transfers. It said that almost everything would be transferred to her children. Elena didn't ask to read it in detail. She looked at the signatures, noticed odd dates, remembered that last week Robert could barely hold a pen. She didn't argue. She put the handkerchief in her bag and decided to leave before someone offered her another coffee. The return trip was unlike any other along that worn-edged road that led from the town to the hill. Michael drove, staring straight ahead, with that concentration Elena had seen in him when he typed numbers on the computer. Julia spoke softly, too softly, and the car stereo sounded as if someone had left it on out of habit. Elena agreed to stop to see a nursing home, one of those proposals shrouded in worry that no longer allows for many questions. For a few kilometers, the landscape was the same as always. Fences falling under their own weight, trees with old nests, the air smelling of damp earth after a light drizzle. It was when she took a detour that led nowhere familiar that her stomach tightened for no apparent reason. The car slowed down and stopped on a stretch without houses, without dogs, without the minimum assurance that someone might look out a window. Michael opened his door, turned around, opened hers, and said something in a neutral tone that Elena understood better from his gesture than from his words. It was the end of her trip. The small blue suitcase containing a coat, a couple of skirts, and Robert's medical papers, which Elena carried out of habit, was brought to her. There were no insults or shoving. There was something colder, more definitive. The idea that, at that age, a mother can become a nuisance, and that the logistics of modern life always find a ditch. The car started smoothly. The dust rose slowly and fell, quickly. Silence was once again the only thing at hand. Elena didn't cry. She stood measuring the distance between what had been her family that morning and what remained now, which was her with a suitcase and a dead phone. She took a deep breath because it was the only thing she could do without asking permission, and told herself she had to move before her body grew cold and her mind began to throw everything into disarray. Elena began walking along that deserted road with short steps, feeling the ground as if every stone could be a trap. The chill in the air seeped into her bones, and her arthritis made every movement of her fingers around the suitcase handle an insistent pain. There were no cars in sight, no birds, only the sound of her own footsteps and the echo of betrayal in her head. She walked aimlessly until, after almost an hour, she heard the roar of an engine approaching. It was an old pickup truck, driven by a neighbor who recognized her immediately and stopped the vehicle. With an incredulous expression, Elena didn't explain much. She just asked for a ride back home. The man didn't ask, perhaps because in a small town, words are unnecessary when the eyes tell a harsher story. The return trip was silent, but every minute in that seat was a reminder that her children had cut any maternal bond at the roots. That night, back in the empty house, Elena didn't turn on all the lights as she usually did. She sat at the kitchen table, her suitcase still closed, and let the darkness envelop her while she tried to sort through the chaos in her head. At one point, she stood up decisively and went to the bedroom closet. From a dusty corner, she pulled out a wooden chest that had been hidden for decades behind old blankets. Inside were the deeds to 20 acres registered in her maiden name, with direct access to the water well, and an envelope of cash saved for years. There were also documents that Robert had asked her to keep, just in case. As she reviewed each page, the pain of abandonment began to transform into an unexpected clarity. She was no longer a helpless old woman. She held in her hands the pieces of a power her children had never imagined. That certainty, born in the midst of the cruelest loneliness, was the first building block of a strategy that was beginning to take shape. At dawn, when the light barely filtered through the worn curtains, Elena made a strong coffee and sat with the documents spread out on the table. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through her body. She remembered Robert's voice telling her it was always better to be prepared, even when it seemed unnecessary. "We never know what can happen, Lena," he would repeat. That day, she realized he had foreseen more than anyone imagined. She decided then that her first move should be to contact Charles Whitman, the local lawyer who had been Robert's loyal friend for decades. She knew she could trust him because she had seen him defend other neighbors against banks and construction companies with uncommon firmness. She dialed the number on the old kitchen phone, and when she heard Charles's voice on the other end, she felt an immediate relief. She wouldn't have to face this battle alone. Charles arrived that same afternoon, carrying a folder under his arm and a serious expression that betrayed his indignation. Together they reviewed the deeds, the dubious signatures on the supposed will, and the savings Elena had kept hidden. He confirmed what she had suspected. Those 20 acres were a legal asset of enormous weight, and the validity of the document Michael had produced was more than questionable. Charles spoke calmly, but each word was like a key opening doors that seemed locked. He explained that they could take immediate action to block any attempt at sale or transfer. Elena listened to him silently, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the papers, as if she wanted to absorb every detail. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt she had a real foothold. The fragility everyone attributed to her was beginning to crack, giving way to a firmness that even she didn't know she still carried within her. The next day, following Charles's advice, Elena headed to the local bank to meet with George Miller. The red brick building stood on the same old corner, with the same stopped clock on the facade that seemed to matter to no one. George welcomed her into his office with that blend of formality and friendliness that only someone from the town could possess. He had known Robert for years and was well aware of the family's reputation. Elena told him, without embellishment, what had happened at the funeral and later on the road. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She just needed someone to act. George listened attentively and, after a few minutes of silence, told her he would freeze any suspicious activity in the accounts until justice had ruled. Those words were like a wall, rising around her. As she left the bank with the receipt for the initial measures in her hand, Elena took a deep breath. Each step was small, but it brought her closer to recovering what they had tried to take from her. That afternoon, she returned home with renewed determination. She lit the wood stove, made a simple soup, and sat by the window with the papers on her lap. The sound of crickets outside reminded her that life went on, even though everything inside had changed. She looked at the dimly lit garden and thought about Robert, about how he always said the earth returns what one sows, for better or worse. Now she understood that that phrase also served to describe people. Michael and Julia had sown greed, and that was what they were beginning to reap. As she ate slowly, she mentally reviewed her next steps. She knew she had to broaden the battle, and the name of Emily Carter, The reporter from the local newspaper, whom she had seen covering injustices in the region, appeared. In her mind, she decided she would call her the next day. It was time for the town to know the truth. The next morning, Elena dialed the local newspaper with the same nervousness one feels when facing a confession. When she heard Emily Carter's young, energetic voice, she hesitated for a second before speaking, but finally shared the essentials. The betrayal at the funeral, the abandonment on the highway, and the suspicious will. Emily didn't interrupt once. She took quick notes, and when Elena finished, she told her she would stop by the farm that afternoon. And she delivered. She arrived with a notebook in hand and a small tape recorder, but above all, her gaze conveyed respect, not morbid curiosity. They sat at the kitchen table, and Elena recounted every detail, her voice occasionally breaking, holding the deeds and papers as if they were shields. Emily promised her that her story would be published, not as gossip, but as a necessary denunciation. 2 days later, the newspaper broke a headline that caught the attention of everyone in Millfield. Widow betrayed by her own children, faces battle for family land. Word spread quickly, because in a small town, news travels faster than the wind. At Maggie O'Connor's bakery, neighbors indignantly discussed what had happened. Some remembered Robert fondly, others asked how they could help. Elena, who had never sought the limelight, suddenly found herself at the center of conversations. At first, it made her uncomfortable, but then she understood that this social pressure was also a weapon. Michael and Julia began receiving uncomfortable calls from acquaintances and associates, questioning their behavior. What had started as a local article became a source of shame for them, and for Elena. It was confirmation that she was not alone. The community supported her, and that gave her a strength she hadn't known she still possessed. The following days were a constant parade of neighbors arriving at the farm with small but meaningful gestures, some bringing fresh bread, others offering help fixing fences or checking the water well. Maggie O'Connor, her childhood friend, appeared with a basket of apples and a clear promise: "You won't go through this alone." Elena greeted them with silent gratitude, surprised to see how the community rallied around her. These weren't just gestures of charity, but displays of respect for a woman who, in everyone's eyes, had been unjustly betrayed. This support network began to restore her confidence, reminding her that there were still people who valued Robert's honest work and memory. Meanwhile, the pressure on Michael and Julia grew every day. In Boston, some of Michael's contacts began to distance themselves, worried about being linked to a possible family fraud. Julia, harassed by creditors, could no longer easily find anyone to lend her money. The calls from her mother that they had previously ignored were now replaced by court orders that Charles, with meticulous precision, filed. Elena watched from the rocking chair on the veranda with a strange feeling. It wasn't revenge that sustained her, but the certainty that, for the first time in a long time, she was in control of the situation. Every move her children made sank them deeper, and every step she took, calmly and with the support of her allies, reinforced the wall that kept them away from what they had tried to take from her. It was in the midst of this turmoil that an unexpected ally appeared. Thomas Reynolds, an old friend of Robert's who had made a career as a renowned lawyer in the state capitol. Upon learning of the situation from Charles, he didn't hesitate to travel to Millfield to meet with Elena. He arrived one cloudy morning, carrying his leather briefcase and a bearing that commanded immediate respect. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Robert used to review invoices with a pencil behind his ear. Thomas listened attentively to every detail, reviewed the documents, and looked up with a seriousness that reassured Elena. "This isn't stopping here, we're going to take it higher." His presence not only provided legal weight, but also brought with it a moral backing that shook any argument Michael and Julia might have made. Thomas's arrival signaled a shift in the scale of the battle. It was no longer just a family matter exposed in the local newspaper. Now there were state lawsuits against the Platinum Acres Construction Company, accused of corrupt practices in land acquisition. Elena, who had always seen herself as a countrywoman, now found herself in the middle of a legal war that transcended her town. Although the turmoil was real, she relied on her allies, Charles with his closeness, George with his financial backing, Emily with the power of the press, and Thomas with the power of the law at the highest levels. Every phone call, every signature on a document was like a silent shot that was disarming her children and the company that supported them. For the first time, Elena didn't feel like the weak piece on the board, but rather like someone capable of maneuvering strategies with precision. With the legal proceedings moving forward and the press amplifying every move, the time for a direct confrontation became inevitable. Charles and Thomas arranged a meeting in the former's office, a small but historic place, with shelves full of old codes and black and white photos of the town. Elena arrived with them, dressed in a dark coat that had belonged to Robert. Her expression was serene, although inside she felt like a turmoil. As she entered the room, she saw Michael and Julia waiting for her, their faces tired and their postures tense. They were no longer the haughty children from the funeral. They looked like two people cornered, aware that the ground beneath them was crumbling. The silence in the room was thick as Charles laid out the documents on the table. Ongoing lawsuits, frozen accounts, evidence of irregularities in the alleged will. Thomas spoke firmly, making it clear there was enough material to initiate criminal proceedings. Elena looked at them without hesitation, with a serenity that contrasted with her children's obvious discomfort. When the agreement completely waiving any right to the inheritance was presented, Michael tried to argue, but his voice cracked when faced with the facts. Julia, staring at the floor, signed without saying anything. Elena calmly took the papers, put them in her bag, and before standing up, said in a low but clear voice that the woman willing to forgive had been left behind on that deserted road. What remained now was justice. When Michael and Julia left the office, the sound of the door closing was like a final echo. There were no hugs, no glances back, only the confirmation that the maternal bond had been broken beyond repair. Elena sat for a few more seconds, breathing slowly, letting reality settle in. Her hands, marked by arthritis, caressed the bag where she kept the signed documents, as if they were armor. Charles placed a hand on her shoulder, and Thomas nodded silently, both aware that this was not just a legal victory, but a personal vindication. Elena stood calmly, as if she knew the hardest part was over. Back at the farm, the landscape seemed different to her, as if the apple trees had regained a color she hadn't seen in months. She paused for a moment in front of the gate and took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air blend with the silent satisfaction of having endured. She entered the house, and for the first time since Robert's death, she felt not emptiness, but determination. She lit the stove, made tea, and sat down in the rocking chair on the porch. She gazed at the horizon with the serenity of someone who knows she's reclaimed what belongs to her. In that moment, she understood that there was no forgiveness possible for her children, but there was a clear future for her and for the land Robert had left her as a legacy. The following days were marked by a renewed energy on the farm. Elena began walking among the apple trees with a notebook in hand, jotting down ideas, necessary repairs, and projects she wanted to pursue. She decided that the 20 acres in her name would not only be a legal defense, but the heart of a renewal. She met with Charles to organize the documentation for the new plans, and with George to open an account for a community fund. The fragile widow many had commiserated with at Robert's funeral had given way to a woman who thought big, with the determination of someone who knows she has nothing left to lose and much to build. The first project to take shape was a farm-to-table restaurant, where produce from the garden would be the basis of the dishes. Elena wanted the town's young people to be able to work there, learn, and feel proud of what the land could offer. She also started a small agricultural scholarship program in Robert's memory, aimed at students interested in sustainable agriculture. The community responded enthusiastically, offering hands, tools, and time. Every day, the farm filled with young voices and neighbors willing to collaborate. Elena watched them as they repaired fences, planted new rows of trees, and painted the old storage house. Each action was a reminder that the land, like life, could be reborn if someone had the determination to care for it. Elena's story soon made headlines again, this time with a very different tone. Emily Carter published an extensive report describing how the widow had gone from being the victim of a family betrayal to becoming the driving force behind a community revival. The photos showed the young people working in the garden, the tables of the new restaurant filled, and Elena on the veranda with the serene air of someone who had reclaimed her place in the world. The article circulated beyond Millfield, reaching regional newspapers and even blogs specializing in sustainable agriculture. For many readers, it was proof that dignity could withstand even the worst betrayals. Meanwhile, the Platinum Acres Construction Company was reeling under the weight of lawsuits filed by Thomas. The courts began receiving allegations of irregularities in different counties, and the press amplified each scandal. Canceled contracts, stalled projects, and a barrage of public criticism tarnished the company's image. What initially seemed like a small local battle had become an example of resilience that exposed the abusive practices of an entire corporation. Michael and Julia, caught in the middle of this storm, were further isolated. For Elena, watching this collapse wasn't cause for noisy celebration, but rather confirmation that justice, when pursued patiently, eventually arrives. As the weeks passed, Elena's farm became a meeting point for the entire town. Every Saturday, she held open days where neighbors could tour the apple orchards, taste fresh produce, and listen to the young people who now worked there speak proudly of what they had learned. What had once been a place associated with the memory of Robert and loneliness was transformed into a space filled with laughter, footsteps, and conversation. Maggie O'Connor would often bring warm bread from her bakery, and between conversations, she would tell visitors how Elena had endured through the darkest times. That narrative began to resonate deeply with the community. She was no longer just a woman, defending her land, but a living example of resilience. Elena, however, kept her feet on the ground. She knew that recognition could fade quickly if she didn't continue working with discipline. She would get up early, walk between the rows of apple trees, and check every detail: the branches that needed pruning, the humidity of the soil, the condition of the fences. That routine, which had once seemed tiresome, now gave meaning to her days. Every afternoon, as she sat in Robert's rocking chair, she felt she had finally managed to transform her pain into something useful, something that transcended her. She wasn't seeking reconciliation with Michael or Julia. In her heart, that door was closed. What she did seek, and found every day, was the certainty of having upheld her husband's legacy and made it a source of life for others. One autumn afternoon, while organizing papers at the kitchen table, Elena found an envelope among the letters in the mail with no clear return address. She opened it carefully and immediately recognized Julia's handwriting. The letter was short, written in halting sentences that pleaded for understanding and spoke of mistakes made under pressure. Julia mentioned her debts, the loneliness she'd fallen into, and the need to start over. For a moment, Elena felt a knot in her stomach. These words appealed to the mother she had been all her life. But as she reread each line, she remembered the deserted road, the suitcase in her hands, and the engine. Driving away without anyone looking back. She put the letter in a drawer without replying, convinced that some wounds don't heal with belated apologies. That decision wasn't easy for her, but it was necessary. She understood that compassion couldn't be confused with forgetting what had happened. Julia had crossed a line that was impossible to undo, and opening the door meant exposing herself to the same cycle of manipulation once again. Elena took a deep breath, made herself some tea, and went out onto the veranda. From the rocking chair, she watched the young people finish their day on the farm, laughing and joking as they carried crates of apples. That scene reminded her that she had chosen a different path, a path where her energy was invested in building, not repairing the irreparable. The silence that had once suffocated her now felt like a shield. Hard, yes, but also protective. As the months passed, Elena found a new rhythm that sustained her without needing to look back. The restaurant was operating at full capacity. The scholarships were beginning to change the lives of the first young beneficiaries, and the farm was regaining the splendor it had enjoyed in its best years with Robert. The community saw her as a beacon of inspiration, but she continued with her usual simplicity, getting up at dawn, walking the fields, and sharing a coffee with the workers before starting the day. Every day confirmed that she had made the right decision in closing the door to her children, because she had chosen to open a much larger one that connected her legacy with future generations. On quiet afternoons, she would sit in Robert's rocking chair, watching the sun set behind the apple trees. The creaking of the wood beneath her body and the smell of damp earth were reminders of a lifetime of sacrifice and resilience. She no longer thought of Michael or Julia. Their names had become distant echoes, shadows of a past that deserved no space in her present. What gave her peace was seeing the young people running among the trees, hearing the voices of neighbors expressing gratitude for her support, and feeling that the estate was once again a place of life, not of dispute. Thus, in silence, she knew she had won the most important battle, to regain her dignity and transform betrayal into justice.